Hello, friends of Hope Talk Online. Welcome to our lectionary reflections that Hope Talk Online is doing every week. This week is for the 29th of August, and we are today Graham Goodwin and myself, Lauren Matthew. We are members of the MCSA Connectional LGBTIAQ Task Team. And yeah, welcome to our reflections. We're going to begin with a little meditation, and then I will take you through the readings that we are going to have this week. And Graham is doing a meditation on the Song of Solomon, which is one of our readings.
And so, friends, I just invite you just to hear the words of the Song of Solomon as it appears in our lectionary reading. The voice of my beloved. Look, he comes leaping upon the mountains, bounding over the hills. My beloved is like a gazelle or a young stag. Look, there he stands behind our wall, gazing in at the windows, looking through the lattice. My beloved speaks and says to me, arise, my love, my fair one, and come away. For now the winter is past, the rain is over and gone. The flowers appear on the earth, the time of singing has come, and the voice of the turtle dove is heard in our land. The fig tree puts forth its figs, and the vines are in blossom. They give forth fragrance. Arise, my love, my fair one, and come away. And I want to just invite you for a moment to maybe wherever you are and whatever you're doing, just to stop and be still. Maybe close your eyes and just take a few moments to follow your breath. And I want to invite you to allow your breath to carry you inward a little, to move you away from everything that distracts and pulls at your attention and into your own body. And just to ask how it feels to be in your body in this moment. And if you can, just become aware of your body. Become aware of your skin, the surface of who you are. Everything that is your story, everything that you have lived, everything that you know, everything that you feel and have felt is contained within the skin. It is in the container of the skin and through the skin that you live in the world. It is also through the container of the skin that you have received everything you know. All sight, all sound, all touch, all taste. It is this body that has learnt. And then you are this container. It is you and you are it. And so maybe we can take a moment just to cherish this body, what it holds, what it has learnt, and the potential that it has to express who you are, what you have learnt, what you have held in the world. For the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Amen.
Amen, Graham. And thank you for sharing that reflection with the body and the breath and the sensuality of, and linking it with the sensuality of the Song of Solomon. So today's readings are for I'm just trying to work out the 14th Sunday. No, not the 14th Sunday.
We are this Sunday on proper 17.
Yeah, proper 17th, the 14th Sunday after Pentecost. Okay. Yeah, and so our readings for the 29th of August are as follows. Our first reading is from Deuteronomy chapter 4, and it's a bit of a mishmash. So we're reading from verses 1 and 2, and then verses 6 to 9. The semi-continuous reading is the book, one of the set of the books of wisdom, which is the Song of Solomon, and reading from chapter 2 and verses 8 to 13. And this is what Graham read for us as we began just now. Then our psalm for today is Psalm 15, which is a bit of a shortish psalm. And our gospel reading moves away from John's gospel, and we are now back in the Mark story, the Markan story. And again, we're reading a bit of a mishmash. So we're reading from chapter 7, reading verses 1 to 8, 14 to 15, and then 21 to 23. The end of, or the last addition to our set of lectionary readings this week is from the letter James, reading from chapter 1 and verses 17 to 27. And we'll be journeying with James for about, 5 weeks?
Correct.
So we will be unpacking it a little bit next week. But this week we'll be focusing mostly on the Gospels and the 2 Old Testament or First Testament readings. Now, on a cursory glance through the readings, it seems like the Song of Solomon doesn't quite fit in with the arc that is linked between Mark 7 and Deuteronomy 4, because both Mark 7 and Deuteronomy 4 hint at the Torah, the law. It hints at how the law is something that provides identity, security, and a means of meaning making for the people of Israel. So Mark chapter 7 kind of problematizes it a little bit, and we will explore that in a little while. But the Deuteronomy 4 story kind of holds it up before us as a gift, as a way in which God's gracious gift comes to live and reside with the people. Now, just a bit of background to the Deuteronomy kind of arc. We're picking it up at chapter 4. So the first bits of Deuteronomy are all introductory, kind of background story about how Israel got to the brink of entering into the promised land. And Deuteronomy is the big, or it has been attributed to Moses. So it's the big pronouncements of Moses to the people of Israel, just as they're about to enter into the promised land. And we begin to realize, I think in chapter 3, that Moses is not going to be the one who is going to cross over with the people. You know, he brings them to this border. And at this border, before they enter into the promised land, these great instructions and texts are handed to the people of Israel. And Moses then dies at the end of this. So the passage then begins with, a break from the introduction. It goes, so now Israel. And it kind of, in Hebrew, it goes atah. Atah is like a kind of injunction that kind of says to the people, okay, take this part seriously now. It'll be like what my mother would say, okay, now listen up. So all of the other stuff was a preamble. This now is the important part. Israel, give heed to the statutes and the ordinances that I am teaching you to observe, so that you may enter and occupy the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, is giving you. And in that opening statement, two things are kind of revealed, or three things are revealed to the people of Israel. Firstly, that the ordinances and the statutes are not just mere teachings, but they kind of the spaces in which identity and meaning and belonging are going to be stitched together. This is who Israel is. Israel is the people who listen to God, who listen, the Shema, hear now, O Israel, the people who listen. And it also then at the same time holds up an anxiety of the people, land. This is a people who have just left Egypt. They have sojourned across the desert for many years, and land and nomadity or nomadic lifestyle is an anxiety for the people. And then it introduces the sense of identity, the God of your ancestors. So this is not just an arbitrary understanding of God. This is the God of Abraham and Sarah, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob and Leah and Rachel. This is the God who has journeyed with Israel through their topsy-turvy, traumatic kind of life. And this is the God that comes to them in the intimacy of relationship. And that intimacy of relationship is the intimacy of the law. And so in my understanding, I don't know about you, Graham, the law is not just some dry ideas that are put on a piece of stone or a set of tomes and handed over to you to live and obey like code. This is it's indicative, and what underholds everything is the idea that God is in relationship with you. And for me, that kind of comes to the fore in verse 7 of this particular passage, when the Moses character says this to the people: for what other great nation has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is whenever we call to him? So there's a kind of intimacy that is baked into the understanding of the law here, and at the same time, for me, there's also a sense of anxiety that is kind of underlying the text, and a sense of what does it mean to have identity, or what does it mean to be a unique, holy people, a people set apart, a people holding the law, the relationship of Yahweh as their first and foremost space of meaning, so that's my understanding or my take on Deuteronomy. And I also want to say that as I read this, I also get a bit nervous when we talk about the law too much, because the law is like it's a positive, it's a gift, it's a gracious gift on one hand, but it's also at the other hand a tool that causes great harm and hurt in the world, so it's kind of like, it reminds me of the ring of power in Lord of the Rings. It has the potential to do great good, but it also has the potential to bring about great harm. I don't know, Graham, if you want to jump in there.
I think for me, you've really sort of resonated with my sort of reticence when I hear the word law. And of course, traditionally we are, as Protestants, sort of taught to see these two opposing things, law and grace. But of course, those who would come from the Hebrew tradition would tell us that law actually encapsulated grace right from the beginning. But the law itself is a problematic word that we use for the Torah, perhaps, in and of itself. That maybe what we need to reflect on is, what is Torah? What is this that we call the law? And Jesus particularly wrestles with that in our gospel reading. And certainly there's this whole trajectory in scripture. There's this ongoing conversation and this ongoing growing in understanding of what is the law. And the movement is from something external to something internal. The prophets already began to intuit what Jesus would say in our gospel reading, that the law is something that's going to come from our heart. And Torah is really better translated instruction. What is given in the giving of the law is not a set of rules and commandments to be followed blindly or robotically, but rather it is the promise that God will A, be with us, and I think you picked up on that, and B, that God will continue to instruct us in our lived experience. And of course, that's the difficult part of scripture. We wish that what had dropped from the sky was a code book that would give us the roadmap to perfect living. But of course, that's clearly not the case. And anyone who actually reads the Bible will know that's not the case. I mean, there are some of the early commandments that we would never want to apply, and rightly we would contextualize them. They're part of an unfolding understanding that grows within Israel in their very real living. And I think that's the promise, and the and also the potential of the Torah is that God's going to enter into this messy, beautiful, mixed up reality that we actually live and instruct us in and through it. But most of all, God's going to invite us back to our hearts. And I think that's the best way to approach scripture, is when you hear law, we need to take a step back from that to say, okay, how do we actually read scripture itself?
Yeah,
we're not going to understand Torah unless we work out how we read scripture. And one of the first things that we noted, and I think in our conversation, we use that scripture as a conversation, but also scripture is about reading ourselves. And the practice of Torah was Israel reading back on themselves and reflecting on themselves. And it is in that process that they were guided.
So I wonder if we can talk a little bit about that conversation, right? Because one of the key things about this passage that stood out for me in my reflection was that the receiving of the law, of the Torah, of the instruction, happens before the entry into the promised land. So it happens, so it almost the inhabiting of God, you know, and the Psalm 15 will talk about the tent, but the inhabiting of God into the very real, everyday, relational aspects of our humanity happens before the promise is kind of given, you know, or entered into, you know, before it becomes reality, you know, and that's important. But also, it kind of opens up space to have conversation with scripture. Because what's interesting in for me as a person who's now I'm a product of intermarriage, many generations of intermarriage, cultural intermarriage, racial intermarriage. So when I read the text and it speaks against intermarriage, like a part of me like freezes up, um, and I think there's a internal dialogue with the law around how to embody this unique sense of call that the people of Israel understand they have entered into and been summoned into and pulled into through this relationship with Yahweh, which comes to them in the set of instructions, but also in the liberative story, of coming out of Egypt. And at the same time, how that sense of uniqueness leads them constantly into a relationship with others where they're trying to hold their uniqueness as something more important than anybody else's humanity, and so what becomes an inclusive intimacy gets turned into an exclusive insider-outsider relationship with other cultures, with men and women, with ruling class and peasants. It becomes that. And at the same time, in the law are these injunctions to question that and destabilize and problematize that, right? Because then there's the reminder, remember that remember who you are. You were also slaves, but also remember the widow, remember the orphan, remember the foreigner, so, and in this dialogue with the law that the law or the Torah has with itself about how to handle exclusivism and at the same time being inclusive, there's this interesting, problematic, sometimes hurtful dynamic, and that's even like spilt out into the early church's reaction with itself. Now, I don't know how you feel about that, but I think that when we hold the Song of Solomon alongside the story of the Deuteronomy, you kind of get that same kind of pulling against each other. And I know that you did some interesting reading about the Song of Solomon, so that's why I'm linking to that.
So I think before I even get to that, I think you've really hit on something which is, I think, vitally important, that we always, come back to the fact that the Bible is a compass rather than a map. At the end of the day, we would love to have the detailed description of where we need to go. But the problem is the terrain's always changing. So what we're left with is a compass. We have a trajectory in scripture which points us to, and I think that for me, there's two major trajectories that emerge from this collection of readings for this Sunday. And the trajectory is from the outward understanding of holiness and identity towards an inward understanding of holiness and identity. And then also the movement from an exclusive understanding of what it means to be a people in covenant with God to an inclusive understanding. And that's sort of like the compass points we move towards. We've got to work out the terrain. What the Bible does is doesn't give us the final answer, but it gives us the process. And we've got to engage in the same process that Israel engaged in. The process of looking to our past, the process of looking to our present, and the process of imagining what kind of future we're moving towards. And that's what Israel constantly did. And I think we've got to do the same. And I think it'll be rightly pointed out that what we find in the Torah is both something that could be poisonous, but something that can also be healing. And in a sense, we have, if we look at our history, been bitten by the snake of the the destructive aspects of the Torah, but that very same snake produces the anti-venom that we need. And particularly as queer people who are often have been on the receiving end of a particular use of the Torah, it would be tempting for us to throw out the entire biblical law and turn away from it because we recognize its destructive toxicity in the way it's being used. But the very same thing that causes the harm can actually be the source of our healing. And so, particularly when we come to the Song of Solomon, I think that becomes clear that what is helpful, and certainly I'm not learned enough in the Song of Solomon to even like contemplate preaching it this Sunday.
Neither am I, don't worry.
But I think just a couple of points that might help us as a way in. And I think the first is the location of the Song of Solomon in the Jewish tradition. So the Song of Solomon, or the Song of Songs, forms part of 5 scrolls, which are part of the Ketuvim, the writings of the Hebrew scriptures. And those 5 scrolls are each read on a particular Jewish festival. There are 5 main Jewish festivals, and on those 5 main festivals, one of the 5 scrolls is read. And those scrolls are stories like Ruth and Esther.
Yeah.
They are Ecclesiastes. They are the Song of Solomon. And if you think about all of these sorts of stories, they are really outliers in the rest of the biblical tradition, which is largely historical, and recounts the story of God's relationship with Israel from the perspective of those who were in charge at the time. They're very sort of power-centric in the sense that they centered in the priesthood and in the king, the role of the king. But these scrolls are outliers in that they tell a little bit of a different story. If you look particularly at Esther, at Ruth, at Song of Solomon, they also don't mention God too much, 3 of them. And Ecclesiastes is a little bit of an outline in its own way, but really what we have in these stories is a counterpoint to the general narrative of Israel. And Israel held before themselves this counterpoint, this minority story, as a way of saying that in the big story of who we are is the smaller story of what this means in the actual nuts and bolts living of life. But also what they do is throw a different perspective on the bigger story. So if you take the book of Ruth, for example, Ruth is read on the Festival of Weeks when the law is given to the people of Israel. That's the celebration of the law. And Ruth really works out, what does it mean to live out chesed? What does it mean to live out chesed in the real nuts and bolts stuff of love and loss and life and economic challenges? What does this look like? And it tells a story. And it invites us out of our head and into our heart, the place where real transformation takes place. The same is true of the other stories. So that brings us to the Song of Songs. Long intro to there, but the Song of Songs is really is associated with the festival of the Passover, and it would really seem odd that you have this highly sexual, intimate poem being read at the key moment of Israel's history being celebrated, their deliverance from Egypt, and the forming of them as a nation with an identity. And in that moment, when Israel celebrate this, they read this highly sexualized and sort of very bodily, fleshy poem which traditionally has been read two ways. One is that this is a celebration of human love between someone who's feminine and someone who's masculine, or it's used as a metaphor of God's love for Israel, or through Israel, the church. And sometimes these are pitted against each other as two readings. But I think that we can have a bit of a both end. I think what this does is it says that deliverance and redemption look like intimacy.
Yep.
Look like vulnerability.
Yeah.
And that all the facets of our life that basically are broken find their healing in the experiences of intimacy and vulnerability. That's first up. And of course the imagery in just our reading, but also in the whole song, is very earthy, and there's almost this conflation of the images of the body and the images of the earth.
Yeah.
And so it calls us back to, what does it look like to live in intimacy with the earth? What does it look like to experience intimacy with another? What does it look like to experience intimacy with God? Perhaps maybe just some thoughts from Ellen Davis, who helped me more than anyone else to sort of look at this this poem, and of course it is poetry. She notes this: intimacy is the means whereby human life in this world is sanctified. No generation has stood more in need of that affirmation than the present one. Our world is groaning under the burdens of instantaneous contracts and temporary relationships, high mobility, commitments lightly undertaken and readily set aside. Too many souls are stunted, arrested in permanent adolescence. This is true with regard to sexual relationships and also in other areas of human experience to which the song points: religious experience and relations between humans and the natural world. Through our wounds in these three, which go back to Eden, we may agree that the illness has now reached crisis proportions. So she's quite dramatic in her view of our society right now. But I think there's really a recognition that what Song of Solomon does is it takes us back to Eden in a way, and the language definitely evokes that, but invites us back into intimacy again. She says the cultivation of real intimacy with God and other humans, with creatures, is the greatest social and spiritual challenge of our time. And I think there is something very real in that. And if we're looking at the intention of the law and holding it up, and the intention of Israel as a people who would live in intimacy with God, what Song of Solomon does is invites us to imagine how that flows out into our relationships with others and with the earth. It kind of breaks down the barriers between sexuality and spirituality, but perhaps the place where we are most vulnerable, where we are most able to experience a healthy, beautiful vulnerability, and also where we can experience the violation of who we are is in the sexual area of our lives.
Yeah, that's very true. I think, as you were speaking, and as I was holding the Song of Solomon within me, I think, the inbreaking of intimacy, I think, is the thing that I want to take away. Like it's a sensual, erotic, in all senses of the word, and in intimacy, and I think that's what the Torah is supposed to lead us into, because it's the inbreaking of this intimacy of God into every aspect of our human lives that is liberative. That is liberation, you know, and how that, you know, challenges, you know, the big systemic things like race and gender and culture and economics, and how that also challenges how we form identity around the places of contestation in ourselves, you know. But what I take away from the reading of the Song of Solomon and the Deuteronomy reading together is how queer the law is, that, you know, how it slips out of all the definitions that we wanted to hold for us, you know, and when we try and capture it and take it to make it serve our ends, to hold and preserve our uniqueness, we miss the intimacy within it. We miss the invitation, the sensual invitation to live the intimacy of God in these spaces of our politics, of our racial relationships, of our sexuality, our gender identities, and our relationship with the earth, you know. And then it becomes a simple, you know, moralistic reading rather than vulnerable intimacy that that is with us. And I think I'm going to segue nicely into the gospel readings, because I think that's what the gospel
I was going to
reading
go there too.
Yeah, you know. And I think the thing that first struck me about the gospel readings is not so much the breaking of the law, was that the disciples were eating. You know, they were eating off the ground, or you know, with undefiled, with hands that were not washed. So they were very, you know, how can you put it, organic, you know. So it's again like, you know, the body images, you know, your hands that are part of our interaction and our blurring of boundaries between people, between communities, between how you put it, the earth and ourselves, the things that cross over between what is clean and unclean in our imaginations, you know, our hands and our bodies, the agencies that help us navigate all of these spaces. And I think that's something that struck me about this particular passage, you know, like how messy and bodily this is, you know, and particularly when we have to sanitize everything right now and like wash cups and like wash everything. And I think it just like brought it to me quite like loudly, you know.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, yeah. I'll stay away from the coronavirus jokes. We all tired of the COVID. But I think what also stands out for me is, and if I can just use another thought from Ellen Davis, she notes the yearning in the Song of Songs. And the gospel speaks about really the locus of our behavior beginning in the heart. And I think that what Jesus brings us back to is the true center of who we are as people of faith, is that we are a people who seek to befriend and know and live from our heart. And I think we always want to move towards the didactic, to the defining, to the stuff of control, and that's not where real transformation takes place in our life. It's always going to throw from the heart outwards, and that's the messy stuff of our life. But you know, the real power of the gospel is this invitation back into our heart and to the work of the heart. And we tend to avoid that so much. You know, we fall into the we fall into the head, into the debate, into the doctrine. And clearly the story of Scripture again and again says that's not what is going to help you be fruitful in the world.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like, it's, because Jesus places it, he takes it away from the obsession that we have with upholding certain neurotic aspects of our laws and our parameters of morality. I grew up in a house where, like, my dad he has this ritual. So when you come home, the first thing you have to do is wash your hands. You got to change. You got to take off the shoes you were wearing outside and put on the shoes you're going to wear in the house, right? And you got to wash your hands, and because you don't want to bring the germs from the outside into the inside, and I like how Jesus, like, rips us out of that, because there's a certain kind of comfort when you don't have control over your life, when you can't control, when you don't have access to your agency, and I think this is the thing about the people of Israel, and I think this is the thing about the Pharisees, and I don't want to hold them up as the enemy, because they're not the enemy, it's us. So when we feel particularly assailed, we tend to control our boundaries a lot, and how Jesus rips us out of that and says it's actually not what happens outside of us that is the thing that defiles the world. It's actually what comes out from inside of us, and then how we use the things of God to enact the paranoia, the fear, the anxiety, the bigotry, to justify our uniqueness and to keep us against them. And I think that's what Jesus kind of destabilizes in this. For me, I read it and I thought about what has been termed the homosexual debate in the MCSA, right? And how, the toing and froing and the pulling and the name calling across the divides about who can be in and who can be out, who must be out, and how the who must be out ends up always being the people that we don't want and don't like, and and that naming, that categorization of naming somebody as unhuman is a wicked thing, when God actually comes in intimacy to all life. And that's where evil resides, in that activity. And particularly when we take something that is about a grace that is bigger than us, and we narrow it down to be about how we can safeguard what we think is important for us, that excludes everybody else.
I mean, I think that this passage, more than any other, highlights for me the actual sort of insanity of trying to assume that sort of the letter of words of Scripture are the defining standard for faith and faithfulness, rather than the intention behind those words and the heart behind those words. I mean, Jesus clearly here advocates the breaking of the Jewish law because it's unhelpful in this situation. And throughout the Gospels, Jesus is quite nonchalant around his sort of observance of the letter of the Jewish law. Because obviously Jesus is more concerned about intentions and human flourishing. And I think that has particular light for the debate around homosexuality and queer inclusion in the church, that the debate has been so focused on what people are doing. It's been so focused on the externals that we've completely missed the point Jesus was pointing us to. The intentionality around relationship, and this kind of sort of love the sinner, hate the sin kind of dichotomy, which is completely ridiculous, completely belies the fact that our inward and our outward are enmeshed in one another. And so my ability to be in relationship with my partner, who happens to be of the same gender, is actually the outworking of the best part of who I am, the part of me that's capable of generosity and intimacy and vulnerability, and where that is reciprocated, I find my whole life flourishing, as the Song of Songs will point to the interconnectedness of our flourishing. And so, for what it's worth, just to throw that in there, and I think that's really because as faith institutions, we've lost something of the power of who we are, in the losing of, I think, our spiritual practice. We've made our faith about our doctrines, our structures, just as much as Israel did. And I think there is a need for us to return to the practice of our faith as an inward contemplative exercise of knowing ourselves, and from that knowing, engaging others in that knowing. And I think that for me, the sort of invitation in the gospel reading is back to a contemplative form of spirituality, a spirituality which focuses on our heart. And I think contemplative spirituality is, for me, what's going to help us unlock some of the.
And I think my parting shot with this is, this week, and I know we haven't had time for the letter and for the psalm, but I think my parting shot is that I think the whole arc of the readings this week call me, anyway, as I read it, to the queering of my understanding of law. And just when I think that laws are about a set of instructions or a set of pre-organized bits of information to help me live a very, very curated kind of life, I realize that actually the law is in the intimacy. So it's the things that keep me connected to the aliveness of God and the presence of this God that breaks in, like Solomon does, tapping at the windows and looking through the lattices, this God that is always intrusive into everything, this God that births life constantly. It's the things that keep me connected to this God, and connected to this God in others, and connected to this God in the earth, and the stories and the value that the earth and other people bring me. And it pulls me, yes, into a contemplative place, because you have to take some serious time to listen beyond the lenses that we have been conditioned to carry, hence the queering, right? But it also pulls me into activity that is not necessarily the activity I can predict by these laws. But it's an activity that mirrors the love of God and the intimacy of God in the world. And that is what the Torah is, the mirroring of God's holiness, God coming near into the world. And that's where I want to leave it for today. Yeah.
And so maybe I can just close with a quote from also Ellen Davis, who led me through my reflection. She said, and of course she uses the word mysticism for what we would call contemplation. Mysticism is not an escape from reality, but the opposite. It is a prayerful penetration of reality, guided by both the imagination and the scriptures, which address themselves in such large part to the imagination. The biblical term for the imaginative capacity is heart, something with which everyone is equipped. So mysticism is not the province of the chosen few, rather is this heart knowledge of God in the world, that God has made and is within the reach of every thinking person. And because mystical thinking allows us to penetrate reality more deeply than we normally do, it is a highly practical skill for a person, a church, or a society in crisis. I believe that the Song of Songs can help us develop the sort of mystical sensibility that may lead us to our healing in every sphere.
I just had a brain fart while you were saying that, because one of the things I took away from our extensive reading of the David and Solomon cycle is the idea of the listening heart, and the hearts in Israel's tradition as being the place where wisdom and the knowledge of God reside. And so maybe that's what we're being called to again, to the listening heart, rather than to a robotic enactment of a set of rules and regulations that we interpret in a very fluid way anyway. So yeah. Anyway, that's us for this week. We will catch you again next week. We are going to be exploring the contours of the season of creation. This is from the World Council of Churches. So we're still using the lectionary readings as per the World Council of Churches guidelines, but we are going to be centering and privileging the story of the earth. And we hope to have a few people along with us to contribute to our conversations. But that's where we are.
Thank you.
So have a wonderful, wonderful week and a blessed, blessed Sunday.
Take care all.